Pergolesi's La Serva Padrona in Italy, and Rousseau's Le Devant du Village in France. Even composers of greater stature were seduced by the charms of this more middle-class entertainment and its anti-aristocratic leanings. Mozart, who was treated poorly by the nobility during his adult life, wrote one opera Le Nozze di Figaro, in which a barber and a maid outsmart a count and hold him up to public ridicule, and in his Don Giovanni the villain is a leading nobleman of the town. The nobility took seriously the threat that such works posed to the established social order. Indeed, the play that served as the basis for Mozart's Figaro was initially banned by the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. By the time of the French Revolution, comic opera, a rebellious upstart, had nearly driven the established opera seria off the 18th century stage. Download a supplementary listening guide for Giovanni Pergolesi, La Serva Padrona, aria, Stizzoso, Mio Stizzoso, at the text website. Public concerts. The social changes of the 18th century, in turn, affected who listened to classical music. In an earlier day, the average citizen might have heard sacred vocal music in a church, and that was about all. But by mid-century, the bookkeeper, physician, cloth merchant, and stock trader collectively had enough disposable income to organize and patronize their own concerts. In Paris, then a city of 450,000 residents, one could attend, as proclaimed, the best concerts every day with complete freedom. The most successful Parisian concert series was the Concert Spirituel, at which the West's first non-court orchestra played a regular schedule of performances, all open to the public. The Concert Spirituel advertised its performances by means of flyers distributed in the streets. To make its offerings accessible to several strata of society, it also instituted a two-tiered price scheme for a subscription series. Children under 15 were admitted for half price. Thus we can trace to the middle of the 18th century the tradition of middle-class citizens paying an admission fee and attending a public performance. The institution of the concert, as we know it today, dates from this time. Figure 15.4. A performance at the Burgtheater in Vienna in the late 1700s. The nobility occupied the frontmost seats on the floor, but the area behind them was open to all. So, too, in the galleries, the aristocracy bought boxes low and close to the stage, while commoners occupied higher rungs, as well as the standing room in the fourth gallery. Ticket prices depended, then as now, on proximity to the performers. Copyright Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. In London, entrepreneurs offered concerts in the Vauxhall Gardens, an 18th-century amusement park drawing as many as 4,500 paying visitors daily. Here symphonies could be heard inside in the orchestra room, or outside, when the weather was good. When Leopold Mozart took his young son Wolfgang to concerts there in 1764, he was surprised to see that the audience was not segregated by class. Likewise in Vienna, the Burgtheater, City Theater, opened in 1759 to any and all paying customers, as long as they were properly dressed and properly behaved. Although the nobility still occupied the best seats, the doors of the concert hall were now open to the general public, fostering a leveling between classes with respect to all the fine arts. The middle class was seizing control of high culture from the aristocracy. Classical music was becoming public entertainment. The advent of the piano. The newly affluent middle class wished not only to listen to music but also to play it. Most of this music-making was centered in the home and around an instrument that first entered public consciousness in the classical period, the piano. Invented in Italy about 1700, the piano gradually replaced the harpsichord as the keyboard instrument of preference, and with good reason, for the piano could play at more than one dynamic level. Compared with the harpsichord, the piano could produce gradual dynamic changes, more subtle contrasts, and, ultimately, more power. Those who played this new domestic instrument were mostly amateurs, and the great majority of these were women. A smattering of French, an eye for needlepoint, and some skill at the piano, these were signs of status and gentility that rendered a young woman suitable for marriage. For the non-professional woman to play in the home, however, a simpler, more homophonic style of keyboard music was needed, one that would not tax the presumed technical limitations of the performer. The spirit of democracy may have been in the air, but this was still very much a sexist age. It was assumed that ladies would not wish, as one publication said, to bother their pretty little heads with counterpoint and harmony, but would be content with a tuneful melody and a few rudimentary chords to flesh it out. Collections such as keyboard pieces for ladies were directed at these new musical consumers. Figure 15.5. Marie Antoinette, in 1770 at the age of 15, seated at an early piano. In 1774, this Austrian princess became Queen of France, but in 1793, at the height of French Revolution, she was beheaded. Copyright Kunsthistorisches Museum, Vienna. The Bridgman Art Library. Elements of classical style. Much has been written about the classical style in music, its quiet grace, noble simplicity, purity, and serenity. It is certainly classical in the sense that emphasis is placed on formal clarity, order, and balance. Compared with the relentless, often grandiose sound of the Baroque, classical music is lighter in tone, more natural, yet less predictable. It is even capable of humor and surprise, as when Joseph Haydn explodes with a thunderous chord in a quiet passage in his Surprise Symphony. But what in precise musical terms creates the levity, grace, clarity, and balance characteristic of classical music? Melody. Perhaps the first thing that strikes the listener about the music of Haydn or Mozart is that the theme is often tuneful, catchy, even singable. Not only are melodies simple and short, but the phrases tend to be organized in antecedent, consequent, or question, answer, pairs. Indeed, antecedent, consequent phrases appear in significant number for the first time in the history of music during the classical period. The melody usually progresses by playing out these short phrases in symmetrical groups of 2, 3, 4, 8, 12, or 16 bars. The brevity of the phrase and the frequent cadences allow for ample light and air to penetrate the melodic line. At the top of the next page is the theme from the second movement of Mozart's Piano Concerto in C major. It is composed of 2 3-bar phrases, an antecedent and a consequent phrase. The melody is light and airy, yet perfectly balanced. It is also singable and quite memorable. Indeed, it has been turned into a popular movie theme. Contrast this to the long, asymmetrical melodies of the Baroque that were often instrumental in character. Example 15.1. Harmony. After about 1750, all classical music assumed a more homophonic, less polyphonic character. The new tuneful melody was supported by a simple harmony. Note that in example 15.1 only 2 chords, tonic and dominant, support Mozart's lovely melody. The heavy basso continuo of the Baroque era has disappeared entirely. The bass still generates the harmony, but it does not always move in the regular, constant fashion typified by the Baroque walking bass. Rather, the bass might sit on the bottom of one chord for several beats, even several measures, then move rapidly, and then stop again. Thus, the rate at which chords change, the harmonic rhythm, as it is called, is much more fluid and flexible with classical composers. To avoid a feeling of inactivity when the harmony is static, classical composers invented new patterns for accompaniment. Sometimes, as in example 15.1, they simply repeat the accompanying chord in a uniform triplet rhythm. More common is the pattern called the Alberti bass, named after the minor Italian keyboard composer Domenico Alberti, who popularized this figure. Instead of playing the pitches of a chord all together, the performer spreads them out to provide a continual stream of sound. Mozart used an Alberti bass at the beginning of his famous C major piano sonata. Example 15.2. The Alberti bass serves essentially the same function as both the modern boogie-woogie bass and the process of tapping on a guitar. It provides an illusion of harmonic activity for those moments when, in fact, the harmony is stationary. Rhythm. Rhythm, too, is more flexible in the hands of Haydn and Mozart than it was in the music of the Baroque era, animating the stop-and-go character of classical melody and harmony. Rapid motion may be followed by repose and then further quick movement, but there is little of the driving, perpetual motion of Baroque musical rhythm. Texture. Musical texture was also transformed in the latter half of the 18th century, mainly because composers began to concentrate less on writing dense counterpoint and more on creating charming melodies. No longer are independent polyphonic lines superimposed, layer upon layer, as in a Baroque fugue of Bach or a polyphonic chorus of Handel. This lessening of counterpoint made for a lighter, more transparent sound, especially in the middle range of the texture. Mozart, after a study of Bach and Handel in the early 1780s, infused his symphonies, quartets, and concertos with greater polyphonic content, but this seems to have caused the pleasure-loving Viennese to think his music too dense. Figure 15.6. Many major artists of the 18th century journeyed to Rome to absorb the ancient classical style and what they created in painting and architecture we now call neoclassicism. Among such classically inspired painters was the Englishwoman Angelica Kauffman, who's the artist in the character of design listening to the inspiration of poetry shows classical balance and ancient symbols. The simplicity, balance, and static quality of the painting create a feeling of calm, serenity, and repose, sentiments often felt in classical music as well. Mary Evans' Picture Library. The image works. The dramatic quality of classical music. What is perhaps most revolutionary in the music of Haydn, Mozart, and their younger contemporary, Beethoven, is its capacity for rapid change and endless fluctuation. Recall that in earlier times, a work by Purcell, Corelli, Vivaldi, or Bach would establish one effect, or mood, to be rigidly maintained from beginning to end, the rhythm, melody, and harmony all progressing in a continuous, uninterrupted flow. Such a uniform approach to expression is part of the single-mindedness of Baroque art. Now, with Haydn, Mozart, and the young Beethoven, the mood of a piece might change radically within a few short phrases. An energetic theme in rapid notes may be followed by a second one that is slow, lyrical, and tender. Similarly, textures might change quickly from light and airy to dense and more contrapuntal, adding tension and excitement. For the first time, composers began to call for crescendos and diminuendos, a gradual increase or lessening of the dynamic level, so that the volume of sound might continually fluctuate. When skilled orchestras made use of this technique, audiences were fascinated and rose to their feet. Keyboard players, too, now took up the crescendo and diminuendo, assuming that the new, multi-dynamic piano was at hand in place of the older, less flexible harpsichord. These rapid changes in mood, texture, color, and dynamics give to classical music a new sense of urgency and drama. The listener feels a constant flux and flow, not unlike the continual swings of mood we all experience. An example of classical style. To experience the essence of the classical style in music, let us turn to an aria from Mozart's comic opera Le Nozze di Figaro. Recall that the libretto of this opera was taken from a revolutionary play that criticized the aristocracy. It was Mozart's idea to set this play to music, softening only slightly its call for a new social order. Social tension is immediately apparent at the beginning of the opera. The main character is Figaro, a clever, mostly honest barber and manservant who outwits his lord, the philandering, mostly dishonest Count Almaviva. We first meet Figaro as he discovers that he and his betrothed, Susanna, have been assigned a bedroom next to the Count's. The Count wishes to exercise his ancient droit de seigneur, the lord's claim to sexual favors from the servant's fiancée. Figaro responds with a short aria, Se vol ballare. Here he calls the Count by the diminutive Countino, translated roughly as, Count, you little twerp, and vows to outwit his master. Example 15-3 shows the simplicity, clarity, and balance typical of the classical style. The texture is light and homophonic, really only supporting chords, as if Figaro were accompanying himself on the guitar. The melody begins with a 4-bar phrase that immediately repeats at a higher level of pitch. Formally, the aria consists of 4 sections, A, B, C, and D, with a return to A at the end. Section A has 5 4-bar phrases, and so do sections B and C, while section D has twice that number. Although the sections are connected by a measure or two of purely instrumental music, the vocal sections of this aria thus have the proportions 20 plus 20 plus 20 plus 40 plus 20, a balanced, classical arrangement indeed. Figure 15:7. Bryn Terfel as the combative and cunning Figaro performs in an English National Opera production of The Marriage of Figaro. Robbie Jack Corbis. Example 15:3. The dynamic quality of classical music, its capacity to encompass changes of mood, is also evident in Figaro's Se vol ballare. Figaro begins in a calm, measured manner, but the more he thinks about the Count's lechery and treachery, the more anxious he becomes. Musically, we hear Figaro's agitation grow throughout sections A, B, C, and D, each gaining in intensity. Only at the end does the barber regain his composure, as signaled by the return of A. Mozart casts the aria, Se vol ballare, within the context of a dance, specifically, the courtly minuet. Here dance serves as a metaphor for a shuffling of social order. If the Count wants to dance, Figaro, the servant, will call the tune. To take listening exercise 22 for this musical selection online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Enlightenment comic opera buffa pianoforte Alberti bass. 16 classical composers Haydn and Mozart. We tend to think of the music of the classical era as the work of just 3 composers, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. There were, of course, others. At the very beginning of the classical period, Haydn was greatly influenced by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, then residing in Berlin, just as Mozart was by this Bach's half-brother Johann Christian Bach, living in London. In the 1790s, the symphonies of Mozart were not as well known in Paris and London as those of Haydn's pupil, Ignace Pleyel. Mozart once played a piano competition against Muzio Clementi, whose sonatas are still studied by beginning pianists today. Haydn's younger brother Michael, who worked in Salzburg, composed a symphony in G that was long thought to be Mozart's. As this confusion suggests, there were other musicians in Europe during the classical era whose compositional skills were not so much less than those of the 3 great masters. The best compositions of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, however, belong in a class all their own. Vienna, a city of music. New Orleans jazz, Hollywood film music, and the Broadway musical, these are all names that suggest that a particular locale became the epicenter for the development of a distinctive kind of music. So, too, with the Viennese classical style. The careers of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and the young Franz Schubert all unfolded in Vienna, and from Vienna radiated their powerful musical influence. For that reason, we often refer to them collectively as the Viennese school and say that their music epitomizes the Viennese classical style. Figure 16.1. A map of 18th century Europe showing the Holy Roman Empire and the principal musical cities, including Vienna, Austria. Vienna was then the capital of the old Holy Roman Empire, a huge expanse covering much of Western and Central Europe. In 1790, the heyday of Haydn and Mozart, Vienna had a population of 215,000, which made it the 4th largest city in Europe, after London, Paris, and Naples. Vienna served as the administrative center for portions of modern-day Germany, Italy, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Slovakia, Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, in addition to all of Austria. It was bordered to the east by vast agricultural lands, with no other large city for hundreds of miles. The landowning aristocracy from even as far away as Russia congregated in Vienna, especially during the long winter months when there was little agricultural work to be supervised. The nobles patronized music, often enjoying it together with middle-class citizens at public concerts. There were theaters for German and Italian opera, concerts in the streets on fine summer nights, and ballroom dances where as many as 4,000 persons might sway to a minuet or a waltz by Mozart or Beethoven. With so much musical patronage to offer, Vienna attracted musicians from throughout Europe. Haydn moved there from Lower Austria, Mozart from Upper Austria, his rival Antonio Salieri from Italy, and Beethoven from Bonn, Germany. Later, in the 19th century, in addition to native-born Franz Schubert, outsiders such as Anton Bruckner, Johannes Brahms, and Gustav Mahler spent many of their most productive years there. Even today, Vienna remains the capital of a nation that spends nearly as much money on its state opera as it does on national defense. Franz Joseph Haydn. Joseph Haydn was the first of the great composers to move to Vienna, and his life offers something of a rags-to-riches story. Haydn was born in 1732 in a farmhouse in Rohrau, Austria, about 25 miles east of Vienna. His father, a wheelwright, played the harp but could not read music. When the choir director of St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna happened to be scouting for talent in the provinces, he heard the boy soprano Haydn sing and, impressed by his musicianship, brought him back to the cathedral in Vienna. Here Haydn remained as a choir boy, studying the rudiments of composition and learning to play the violin and keyboard. After nearly 10 years of service, his voice broke and he was abruptly dismissed. For most of the 1750s, Haydn eked out a wretched existence, as he called it, working as a freelance musician around Vienna. He gave keyboard lessons, accompanied singers, and sang or played violin or organ at 3 churches each Sunday, moving quickly from one to the next. In 1761, Haydn's years of struggle ended when he was engaged as director of music at the Esterházy court. The Esterházy family was the richest and most influential among the German-speaking aristocrats of Hungary, with extensive landholdings southeast of Vienna and a passionate interest in music. At the family seat at Esterházy, Prince Nicolaus Esterházy constructed a palace influenced by that of King Louis XIV at Versailles. Here he maintained an orchestra, a chapel for singing religious music, and a theatre for opera. As was typical of the period, Prince Nicolaus engaged Haydn to be a musical servant at the court and wear servant's dress. Haydn also was required to sign a contract of employment, one that suggests the subservient place of the composer in 18th-century society. Figure 16, 2. Portrait of Joseph Haydn wearing a wig and the blue livery of the Esterházy court. Courtesy of Professor Daniel Hertz. And all the musicians shall appear in uniform, and the said Joseph Haydn shall take care that he and all the members of the orchestra follow the instructions given, and appear in white stocking, white linen, powdered, and with either a pigtail or a tie wig. The said shall be under obligation to compose such music as His Serene Highness may command, and neither to communicate such compositions to any other person, nor to allow them to be copied, but he shall retain them for the absolute use of His Highness, and not compose for any other person without the knowledge and permission of His Highness. Haydn was thus prohibited from circulating his music without the express permission of his patron. But somehow his symphonies, quartets, and sonatas began to make their way to Vienna and other foreign capitals, much like file sharing today. In the 1770s, they surfaced in Amsterdam, London, and Paris in unauthorized editions. Since there was no international copyright law in those years, a publisher could simply print a work from a copyist's score without the composer's knowledge or consent and without paying royalties. When Haydn signed another contract with Prince Nicolaus in 1779, there was no such exclusive use provision, and he began to sell his works to various publishers, sometimes consigning the same piece to 2 or 3 at the same time. Figure 16, 3. The palace of the Esterházy family southeast of Vienna, where Joseph Haydn lived until 1790. The elements of neoclassical architectural style include the triangular pediment over the entryway, the columns, and the Ionic capitals atop the flat columns. Copyright Imagno Getty Images. For a period of nearly 30 years, Haydn served Nicolaus Esterházy, writing symphonies and divertimentos for evening entertainment, operas for the court theatre, and string trios in which the prince himself might participate. When Nicolaus died in 1790, the Esterházy orchestra was dismissed in favor of a smaller concert band. Haydn retained his title as court composer, as well as his full salary, but he was now free to travel as he wished. After settling briefly in Vienna, he journeyed to London, where he had been engaged at a substantial fee to compose and conduct. From this commission resulted the 12 London symphonies, which were first performed in the Hanover Square Rooms, a large public concert hall built in part with capital supplied by Johann Christian Bach, old Bach's youngest son. Haydn stayed in London during 1791, 1792, and returned again for the concert season in 1794, 1795. He was presented to the King and Queen, received the honorary degree of Doctor of Music at Oxford, and was generally accorded the status of a visiting celebrity, as a letter written within 2 weeks of his arrival attests. Everyone wants to know me. I had to dine out 6 times up to now, and if I wanted, I could have an invitation every day, but first I must consider my health and second my work. Except for the nobility, I admit no callers till 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In the summer of 1795, Haydn returned from London to Vienna a wealthy man. From his activities in London, he had netted 24,000 Austrian gulden, the equivalent about 1.2 million US dollars in money of today, not bad for the son of a wheelmaker. Haydn also returned from England with an abiding love of the oratorios of Handel, and among his last completed works are his own 2 oratorios, The Creation and The Seasons. When he died on May 31, 1809, at the age of 77, he was the most respected composer in Europe. Haydn's long life, commitment to duty, and unflagging industry resulted in an impressive number of musical compositions, 104 symphonies, about 70 string quartets, nearly a dozen operas, 52 piano sonatas, 14 masses, and 2 oratorios. He began composing before the death of Bach and did not put down his pen until about the time Beethoven set to work on his 5th symphony. Thus, Haydn not only witnessed but, more than any other composer, helped to create the mature classical style. Despite his accomplishments, Haydn did not rebel against the modest station assigned to him in traditional 18th-century society. "I have associated with emperors, kings, and many great people," he said, "and I have heard many flattering things from them, but I would not live in familiar relations with such persons. I prefer to be close to people of my own standing." And though keenly aware of his own musical gifts, he was quick to recognize talent in others, especially Mozart. "Friends often flatter me that I have some genius, but he stood far above me." Figures 16:4 and 16:5. An unfinished portrait of Mozart painted by his brother-in-law Joseph Lang during 1789-1790. The child Mozart at the keyboard, with his sister Nannerl and his father Leopold, in Paris in 1764 during their 3-year tour of Europe. Alinari, the Bridgeman Art Library. Copyright British Library Board, London. The Bridgeman Art Library. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Indeed, who, except possibly Bach, could match Mozart's diversity, breadth of expression, and perfect formal control? Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in 1756 in the mountain town of Salzburg, Austria, then a city of about 20,000 residents. His father, Leopold Mozart, was a violinist in the orchestra of the Archbishop of Salzburg and the author of a best-selling introduction to playing the violin. Leopold was quick to recognize the musical gifts of his son, who by the age of 6 was playing the piano, violin, and organ, as well as composing. In 1762, the Mozart family coached off to Vienna, where Wolfgang and his older sister Nannerl displayed their musical wares before Empress Maria Theresa. They then embarked on a 3-year tour of Northern Europe that included extended stops in Munich, Brussels, Paris, London, Amsterdam, and Geneva. In London, Wolfgang sat on the knee of Johann Christian Bach and improvised a fugue. And here, at the age of 8, he wrote his first 2 symphonies. Eventually, the Mozarts made their way back to Salzburg. But in 1768, they were off again to Vienna, where the now 12-year-old Wolfgang staged a production of his first opera, Bastien und die Bastienne, in the home of the famous Dr. Franz Anton Mesmer, the inventor of the theory of animal magnetism. The next year father and son visited the major cities of Italy, including Rome, where, on July 8, 1770, the Pope dubbed Wolfgang a Knight of the Order of the Golden Spur. Although the aim of all this globe-trotting was to acquire fame and fortune, the result was that Mozart, unlike Haydn, was exposed at an early age to a wealth of musical styles: French Baroque, English choral, German polyphonic, and Italian vocal. His extraordinarily keen ear absorbed them all, and ultimately, they increased the breadth and substance of his music. A period of relative stability followed. For much of the 1770s, Mozart resided in Salzburg, where he served as organist, violinist, and composer to the archbishop. But the reigning archbishop, Colloredo, was a stern, frugal man who had little sympathy for Mozart, genius or not. Mozart was given a place in the orchestra, a small salary, and his board. Like the musicians at the court of Esterházy, those at Salzburg ate with the cooks and valets. For a knight of the Golden Spur who had hobnobbed with kings and queens across Europe, this was humble fare indeed, and Mozart chafed under this system of aristocratic patronage. After several unpleasant scenes in the spring of 1781, the 25-year-old composer goaded the archbishop into firing him and set out to make his living as a freelance musician in Vienna. Mozart chose Vienna partly because of the city's rich musical life and partly because it was a comfortable distance from his overbearing father. In a letter to his sister written in the spring of 1782, Wolfgang spells out his daily regimen in the Austrian capital. "My hair is always done by 6 o'clock in the morning, and by 7 I am fully dressed. I then compose until 9. From 9 to 1 I give lessons. Then I lunch, unless I am invited to some house where they lunch at 2 or even 3 o'clock. I can never work before 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and even then I am often prevented by a concert. If I am not prevented, I compose until 9. Then I go to my dear Constanze." Figure 16:6. Young Mozart proudly wearing the collar of a Knight of the Order of the Golden Spur, an honor conferred upon him for his musical skills by Pope Clement XIV in July 1770. Copyright Alinari, the Bridgeman Art Library. Against the advice of his father, Wolfgang married his dear Constanze in the summer of 1782. But, alas, she was as romantic and impractical as he, though less given to streaks of hard work. In addition to his composing, teaching, and performing, Mozart now found time to study the music of Bach and Handel, play chamber music with his friend Joseph Haydn, and join the Freemasons. Although still very much a practicing Catholic, he was attracted to this fraternity of the Enlightenment because of its belief in tolerance and universal brotherhood. His opera Die Zauberflöte is viewed by many as a hymn in praise of Masonic ideals. Figure 16:7. This still from the spectacularly good Academy Award-winning film Amadeus shows Mozart composing at a billiard table. Mozart did in fact keep a billiard table in his bedroom. But in most other ways, the portrayal of Mozart in Amadeus is largely fictitious. Mozart was not an irresponsible idiot savant who died penniless, but a highly intelligent entrepreneur whose income fluctuated wildly from year to year. Moreover, he was not poisoned by his rival, composer Antonio Salieri. But Amadeus does pose an intriguing question: what does a mediocre or even somewhat gifted person do when faced with an absolute genius? Saul Zant's company, the Kobel Collection. The years 1785-1787 witnessed the peak of Mozart's success and the creation of many of his greatest works. He had a full complement of pupils, played several concerts a week, and enjoyed lucrative commissions as a composer. Piano concertos, string quartets, and symphonies flowed from his pen, as did his two greatest Italian operas, The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. But Don Giovanni, a huge success when first performed in Prague in 1787, was little appreciated when mounted in Vienna in the spring of 1788. The opera is divine, perhaps even more beautiful than Figaro, declared Emperor Joseph II, but no food for the teeth of my Viennese. Mozart's music was no longer in vogue with the nobility. His style was thought to be too dense, too intense, and too dissonant. One publisher warned him, "Write in a more popular style or else I cannot print or pay for more of your music." In his last year, despite declining health, Mozart was still capable of creating the greatest sort of masterpieces. He composed a superb clarinet concerto and the Magic Flute, and began work on a Requiem Mass, one he was never to finish. Mozart died unexpectedly on December 5, 1791, at the age of 35. The precise reason for his death has never been determined, though rheumatic fever and kidney failure, made worse by needless bloodletting, are the most likely causes. No single event in the history of music is more regrettable than the premature loss of Mozart. We might think that Michael Jackson died young, but he outlived Mozart by 15 years. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. Key words: Viennese School, Esterházy family, London Symphony, Salzburg Freemasons. 17 classical forms, ternary and sonata. Allegro. How did composers of the classical period reconcile the classical principles of order and balance with their urge to create a more dramatic style of music, music with more contrast in volume, color, and tempo? They did so, in a word, by means of form. In the classical period, more than any other in the history of music, a small number of forms, ternary, sonata, allegro, rondo, and theme and variations, regulated nearly all art music. At the same time, none of these forms was unique to the classical period. Ternary form can be found in the earliest examples of Gregorian chant and in the Baroque da capo aria. The rondo had its origins in the popular dances of the Middle Ages, and its repetitive structure has made it attractive to such diverse musicians as Mozart, Beethoven, Elton John, and Sting. Only sonata, allegro form actually came into being in the classical period. It dominated musical structure during the time of Mozart and Haydn, and remained a potent force in the works of most composers of the Romantic era and in the creations of some 20th-century musicians as well. Thus, the forms discussed in this chapter should be thought of not as belonging to the classical period alone, but in the broader meaning of classical music. With the single exception of sonata, allegro form, all recur in eras and genres throughout the history of Western music. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 9, on ternary and sonata allegro forms, at the text website. Ternary form. Ternary structure is a simple arrangement that can serve as a useful introduction to the more complex sonata, allegro form discussed later in this chapter. Classical composers favored ternary form for its simplicity and directness. Everyone is familiar with the music of the French folk song À vous de rage, Maman, though we recognize the tune as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart came to know the melody when he toured France as a youth, and he composed a setting for keyboard. Example 17, 1. Notice that both units are repeated. Observe also that A is in the tonic, B emphasizes a contrasting key, and the returning A is again in the tonic. If a piece in ternary form is in a minor key, the contrasting B section is usually in what is called the relative major. Needless to say, most pieces in ternary form are more complex than Twinkle. Twinkle most have more contrast of melody, key, and or mood between the B section and the surrounding units of A. Minuet and trio. Sometimes popular dance music grows so popular that it becomes stylized to the point that it evolves into classical music. In a word, dance music becomes listening music. That is the history of the minuet, a stately dance in triple meter, which began in the Baroque era as a popular dance and ended as a stylized movement within a classical symphony or string quartet. At the time of Haydn and Mozart, the minuet served for both dancing and listening. What in 1670 had been a dance in binary form, by 1770 had grown into a ternary movement, and the return home to A had become a major listening event. Traditionally, one minuet was grouped with a second possessing a much lighter texture. Because this second minuet had originally been played by only 3 instruments, it was called the trio, a name that persisted into the 19th century, no matter how many instrumental lines were required. Once the trio was finished, convention dictated a return to the first minuet, now performed without repeats. Because the trio also was composed in ternary form, an ABA pattern was heard 3 times in succession. And, because the trio was different from the surrounding minuet, the entire minuet, trio, minuet movement formed an ABA arrangement. Figure 17, 1. A ball at the red utensil in the Emperor's Palace in Vienna, c. 1800. Mozart, Haydn, and, later, Beethoven composed minuets and German dances for these events, which sometimes attracted nearly 4,000 fee-paying dancers. The orchestra can be seen in the gallery to the left. The red utensil still provides a venue for concerts and balls today. Copyright Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. ABA CDC ABA. Mozart's Ein klein Nachtmusik, written in the summer of 1787, is among his most popular works. It is a serenade, a light, multi-movement piece for strings alone or small orchestra, one intended for an evening's entertainment and often performed outdoors. Although we do not know the precise occasion for which Mozart composed it, we might well imagine Ein klein Nachtmusik providing the musical backdrop for a torchlit party in a formal Viennese garden. The menuetto appears as the third of 4 movements in this serenade and is a model of grace and concision. Figure 17, 2. Couples in the late 18th century dancing the stately minuet. In some areas of Europe at this time, women were forbidden to dance the minuet because it was thought to involve excessive body contact. Copyright Bettman Corbis. Example 17, 2. As you can see, the B section is only 4 measures long, and the return to A does not reproduce the full 8 bars of the original but only the last 4, thus, this pattern might be viewed as ABA. In the trio that follows, a lighter texture is created as the first violin plays a solo melody quietly above a soft accompaniment in the lower strings. The D section of the trio is distinguished by a forte stepwise run up and down the scale, and then the quiet melody of C returns to complete the ternary form. Finally, the minuet appears once again, but now without repeats. We have said that classical music is symmetrical and proportional. Note here how both minuet and trio are balanced by a return of the opening music and how all the sections are either 4 or 8 bars in length. If Mozart's menuetto represents the minuet in its most succinct form, the minuet of Haydn's Symphony No. 94 offers a more typically symphonic presentation of this ternary design. The form is considerably extended, in part because Haydn was writing for a full orchestra rather than the small string ensemble of Mozart's serenade. Notice at the end of B how Haydn builds up great expectation, and holds us back by means of a static pedal point, before delivering the longed-for return home to A. This is the central, emotional event of the movement. Sonata, Allegro form. Most stories and plays have a stereotypical form, setup, complication, resolution. So, too, with sonata, Allegro form, which came into being around 1750 as a means of incorporating more drama and conflict into a single movement of music. Like a great play, a movement in sonata, allegro form has the potential for dramatic presentation, conflict, and resolution. Sonata, allegro form would continue to serve composers into the Romantic period and beyond. Thus, there is no way around it. To understand the core of classical music, we must understand sonata, allegro form. At the outset, however, it is important to distinguish between the general term sonata and the more specific sonata, allegro form, that is, between the multi-movement genre, the sonata, and the single-movement form, sonata, allegro. When a solo piano or some other solo instrument accompanied by piano plays a 3 or 4 movement work, that genre in classical music is called a sonata. By contrast, when a string quartet or an orchestra plays a 3 or 4 movement work, the genre is not referred to as a sonata but rather as a quartet or a symphony. Sonata, then, is a genre for solo instrument. Sonata, allegro, however, is a form giving structure to a single movement of any one of several genres: sonata, string quartet, symphony, even a 1-movement overture. Let's take a typical 4-movement symphony of the classical period. The form of the first movement is almost invariably composed in sonata, allegro form. The first half of the term derives, obviously, from the fact that most sonatas feature this form in their first movement, while the second refers to the standard practice of setting this first movement to a fast tempo. Although the slow second movements and fast finales of classical compositions are sometimes written in sonata, allegro form as well, they often make use of other forms, such as rondo or theme and variations. If there are 4 movements, the third is usually a minuet with trio, and thus in ternary form. To make sense of this, consider the movements and forms of Mozart's Ein klein Nachtmusik and Haydn's Symphony No. 94, Mozart, Ein klein Nachtmusik. Fast. Slow. Minuet and trio. Fast sonata, allegro rondo. Ternary. Rondo. Haydn, Symphony No. 94. Fast. Slow. Minuet and trio. Fast sonata, allegro theme and variations. Ternary. Sonata, allegro. The shape of sonata, allegro form. To get a sense of what might happen in a typical first movement of a sonata, string quartet, symphony, or serenade, look at the diagram below. As with all models of this sort, this one is an ideal, an abstraction of what commonly occurs in sonata, allegro form. It is not a blueprint for any composition. Composers have exhibited countless individual solutions to the task of writing in this and every other form. Yet such a model can be of great use to the listener because it gives a clear picture of what we might expect to hear. Ultimately, once we have embraced the form and are familiar with its workings, we will take as much delight in having our musical expectations foiled or delayed as in having them fulfilled. In its broad outline, sonata, allegro form looks much like ternary form. It consists of an ABA plan, with the B section providing contrast in mood, key, and thematic treatment. The initial A in sonata, allegro form is called the exposition, the B the development, and the return to A the recapitulation. In the early classical period, the exposition and the development and recapitulation were each repeated, as in ternary form. But Haydn and Mozart eventually dropped the repeat of the development and recapitulation, and composers of the Romantic period gradually dispensed with the repeat of the exposition. Let's examine each of these sections in turn and learn what we are likely to hear. Exposition. In the exposition, the composer presents the main themes of the movement. It begins with the first theme or theme group and is always in the tonic key. Next comes the transition, or bridge as it is sometimes called, which carries the music from the tonic to the dominant and prepares for the arrival of the second theme. Often the transition is composed of rapid figural patterns, scales, arpeggios, and melodic sequences, giving us a feeling of movement. The second theme typically contrasts in character with the first. If the first is rapid and assertive, the second may be more languid and lyrical. The exposition usually concludes with a closing theme, often simply oscillating between dominant and tonic chords. Not much is happening harmonically, so we must be near the end. After the final cadence, the exposition is repeated in full. We've now met all the characters of the piece. Let's see how things develop. Development. If sonata, allegro is a dramatic musical form, most of the drama comes in the development. As the name indicates, a further working out, or developing, of the thematic material occurs here. The themes can be extended and varied, or wholly transformed. A character we thought we knew can turn out to have a completely different personality. Dramatic confrontation can occur, as when several themes sound together, fighting for our attention. The contrapuntal possibilities lurking within a theme might emerge, with the composer using it as the subject of a brief fugue. Not only are developments dramatic, they are unstable and unsettling, the harmony typically modulating quickly from one key to the next. Only toward the end of the development, in the passage called the retransition, is tonal order restored, often by means of a stabilizing pedal point on the dominant note. When the dominant chord finally gives way to the tonic, the recapitulation begins. Recapitulation. After the turmoil of the development, the listener greets the return of the first theme in the tonic key of the exposition with welcome relief. Though the recapitulation is not an exact, note-for-note repetition of the exposition, it nonetheless presents the same musical events in the same order. The only change that regularly occurs in this restatement is the rewriting of the transition, or bridge. Because the movement must end in the tonic, the bridge does not modulate to the dominant as before, but stays at home in the tonic key. Thus, the recapitulation imparts to the listener not only a feeling of return to familiar surroundings but also an increased sense of harmonic stability, as all themes are now heard in the tonic key. We've gone on a great musical journey and are now back home safe and sound. The following two elements are optional to sonata, allegro form, functioning something akin to a preface and an epilogue. Introduction. About half the mature symphonies of Haydn and Mozart have brief introductions before the exposition begins. These are, without exception, slow and stately, and usually filled with ominous or puzzling chords designed to get the listener wondering what sort of musical excursion he or she is about to undertake. Coda. As the name coda indicates, this is a section added to the end of the movement to wrap things up. Like tales, codas can be long or short. Haydn and Mozart wrote relatively short codas in which a motive might simply be repeated again and again in conjunction with repeating dominant tonic chords. Beethoven, however, was inclined to compose lengthy codas, sometimes introducing new themes even at the end of the movement. But no matter how long the coda, most will end with a final cadence in which the harmonic motion slows down to just two chords, dominant and tonic, played over and over, as if to say, the end, the end, the end, the end. The more these repeat, the greater the feeling of conclusion. Figure 17, 3. Jazz artist and improv singer Bobby McFerrin conducting the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. McFerrin has conducted orchestras around the world and issued several recordings of Mozart, including his Ein klein nach Musik, heard in the listening guide. Copyright Steve Kagan. Time Life Pictures. Getty Images. Hearing sonata, allegro form. Why all this attention to sonata, allegro form? First, because it is absolutely central to the core repertoire of classical music and beyond. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Mahler, Shostakovich, they all used it. And second, because sonata, allegro form is the most complex and difficult of the classical forms to follow. A sonata, allegro movement tends to be long, lasting anywhere from 4 minutes in a simple composition from the classical period, to 20 minutes or more in a full-blown movement of the Romantic era. Listen to a series of iAudio podcasts on hearing sonata allegro form at the text website. How does one tame this musical beast? First, be sure to memorize the diagram of sonata, allegro form given on page 173. Next, sharpen your ability to grasp and remember melodies. Finally, think carefully about the 4 distinctive styles of writing found in sonata, allegro form: thematic, transitional, developmental, and cadential. A thematic passage has a clearly recognizable theme, often a singable tune. The transition is full of motion, with melodic sequences and rapid chord changes. The development sounds harmonically active, is full of counterpoint, and makes use of a recognizable theme, albeit either extended in length or reduced to short motives. Finally, a cadential passage, coming at the end of a section or the end of the piece, sounds repetitious because the same chords are heard again and again in a harmony that seems to have stopped moving forward. Each of these 4 styles has a specific function within sonata, allegro form: to state, to move, to develop, or to conclude. To test our ability to follow along in a movement composed in sonata, allegro form, we turn to the first movement of Mozart's Ein klein nach Musik. The following listening guide is not typical of this book. It is unusually lengthy so as to lead you through the difficult process of hearing sonata, allegro form. First, read the description in the center column, then listen to the music, stopping where indicated to rehear each of the principal sections of the form. Likely this movement, one of the favorites in the classical repertoire, will seem like an old friend. Its sophisticated sounds have been used as background music in countless radio and TV commercials to suggest that the product is high-end. We associate expensive items with classical elegance. See a fascinating interaction between Mozart's Ein klein Nacht music and the musical style of Bobby McFerrin in the YouTube playlist on the text website. What we have just heard is an example of sonata, allegro form in miniature. Rarely has this design been produced in less time or space, and almost never as artfully. In the classical era, sonatas, quartets, symphonies, and serenades typically began with a movement in sonata, allegro form. So, too, did operas. That is, a classical opera often commenced with an overture, performed by full orchestra, composed in sonata form. A case in point is Mozart's overture to Don Giovanni. Mozart begins this dramatic overture with a slow introduction in a minor key that incorporates some of the musical motives we hear later in the opera. This slow, ominous beginning soon changes to a fast tempo and a major key at the start of the exposition. Because this is an overture to an opera, and not a symphony, the exposition is not repeated. To take listening exercise 23 for this musical selection online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. A discussion of another classical movement in sonata, allegro form can be found on pages 190, 193, along with a listening guide and listening exercise. Finally, if you like the overture to Don Giovanni, you'll love the opera. The central character, Don Giovanni, has all the amoral charm of psychopath Patrick Bateman of American Psycho. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale Courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: ternary form, relative major minuet, trio, serenade, sonata, allegro form, exposition, transition, development, fugato, retransition, recapitulation, coda. Classical forms, theme and variations. Rondo 18. In addition to sonata, allegro, and ternary, there were other important musical forms during the classical period, most notably, theme and variations, and rondo. Both of these forms are simple and straightforward, emphasizing just one theme, in contrast to the multiplicity of themes present in sonata, allegro form. A composition in theme and variations or rondo form may exist as a movement within a multi-movement sonata or symphony, or it may stand alone as a one-movement, independent piece. Theme and variations. In the film Amadeus, Mozart is shown composing variations on a theme of another composer, tossing them off effortlessly like a magician pulling handkerchiefs from his sleeve. The capacity, indeed need, of a great artist for substantive change or modification is called the transformational imperative. Leonardo da Vinci continually transforms one and the same face, just as Shakespeare endlessly riffs on a metaphor for a sunrise. In music, it is not an image or a vision that is varied, but usually a melody. Theme and variations occurs when a melody is altered, decorated, or adorned in some way by changing pitch, rhythm, harmony, or even mode. The object is still recognizable but somehow doesn't seem to sound the same. For theme and variations to work, the theme must be well known or easy to remember. Traditionally, composers have chosen to vary folk songs and, especially, patriotic songs. Those so treated include God Preserve Franz the Emperor, God Save the King, Rule Britannia, and later Yankee Doodle and America. Such tunes are popular, in part, because they are simple, and this, too, is an advantage for the composer. Melodies that are spare and uncluttered can more easily be dressed in new musical clothing. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 10, Sonata Allegro and Theme and Variations, at the text website. Figure 18, 1. Henri Matisse's classically inspired series of bronze sculptures of the head of his model, Jeanette Vadarin, executed in 1910, allows us to visualize the process of theme and variations. The image becomes progressively more distant from the original as we move left to right. Digital image, the Museum of Modern Art, licensed by Scala Art Resource, New York. Broadly speaking, a variation can be effected in either of two ways: by changing the primary theme itself, or by changing the context around that theme, again, dressing it up in new finery. The accompaniment can be modified, for example, by adding figural or contrapuntal embellishment. Changing the theme itself, a more radical transformation, is accomplished by alterations to the theme's melodic or rhythmic profile. Sometimes, these two techniques are used simultaneously. As the variations proceed one to the next, they typically grow in complexity, with the original theme becoming progressively more obscure. The two examples that follow, one by Mozart and one by Haydn, illustrate a number of techniques for altering or embellishing a melody. The primary task of the listener, of course, is to keep track of the tune throughout its various permutations. Mozart, Variations on Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. In the classical period, it was common for a composer-pianist to improvise in concert a set of variations on a well-known tune, perhaps one requested by the audience. Contemporary reports tell us that Mozart was especially skilled in this art of spontaneous variation. In the early 1780s, Mozart wrote down a set of such improvised variations built on the French folk song À vous de rage, Maman, which we know as Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. With a tune as well known as this, it is easy to follow the melody, as it is increasingly ornamented and altered in the course of 12 variations. Example 18, 1a, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Basic Theme. Variation 1 ornaments the theme and almost buries it beneath an avalanche of 16th notes. Would you know that Twinkle, Twinkle lurks herein if you did not have the tune securely in your ear? Example 18, 1b, Variation 1. In Variation 2, the rushing ornamentation is transferred to the bass, and the theme surfaces again rather clearly in the upper voice. Example 18, 1c, Variation 2. In Variation 3, triplets in the right hand alter the theme, which is now only recognizable by its general contour. Example 18, 1d, Variation 3. After the same technique has been applied to the bass, a thematic alteration again occurs in Variation 5. Here the rhythm of the melody is jazzed up by placing part of it off the beat, in syncopated fashion. Example 18, 1e, Variation 5. Of the remaining 7 variations, some change the tune to minor, while others add Bach-like counterpoint against it. The final variation presents this duple-meter folk tune reworked into a triple-meter waltz. Yet throughout all of Mozart's magical embroidery, the theme remains clearly audible, so well ingrained is Twinkle, Twinkle in our musical memory. Haydn, Symphony No. 94, Second Movement. Joseph Haydn was the first composer to take theme and variations form and use it for a movement within a symphony. To be sure, Haydn was an innovative composer. He could surprise or shock like no other composer of the classical period. In his Surprise Symphony, the shock comes in the form of a sudden fortissimo chord inserted, as we shall see, in the second movement in the middle of an otherwise serene theme. When Haydn's Symphony No. 94 was first heard in London in 1792, the audience cheered the second movement and demanded its immediate repetition. Ever since, this surprising movement has been Haydn's most celebrated composition. The famous opening melody of the second movement is written in binary form. And to this simple 16-bar theme, Haydn adds 4 variations. Notice how the beginning of the theme is shaped by laying out in succession the notes of a tonic triad and then a dominant chord in C major. The triadic nature of the tune accounts for its folk song-like quality and makes it easy to remember during the variations that follow. These first 8 bars are stated and then repeated quietly. And just when all is ending peacefully, the full orchestra, including a thunderous timpani, comes crashing in with a fortissimo chord, as if to shock the drowsy listener back to attention. What better way to show off the latent dynamic power of the larger classical orchestra? The surprise fortissimo chord is a dominant chord that leads into the B section of the theme, another 8-bar phrase, which is also repeated but with added flute and oboe accompaniment. With the simple yet highly attractive binary theme now in place, Haydn proceeds to compose 4 variations on it, adding a superb coda at the end. In his memoirs, dictated in 1809, Haydn explains that he included the surprise blast as something of a publicity stunt, to make a debut in a brilliant manner, and thereby call further attention to his concerts in London. Figure 18, 2. The Hanover Square Rooms in London, the hall in which Haydn's Surprise Symphony was first performed in 1792. Designed for an audience of 800, 900, nearly 1,500 crowded in for the performances of these London symphonies. Private collection. The Bridgman Art Library. After listening to this movement by Haydn, you can understand that hearing theme and variations form requires listening to discrete units of music. Each block is marked by some new treatment of the theme. In the classical period, all the units are usually the same size, that is, have the same number of measures. The variations become progressively more complicated as more ornamentation and transformation are applied, but each unit remains the same length. The addition of a coda after the last variation gives extra weight to the end, so the listener feels that the set of variations has reached an appropriate conclusion. If such extra bars were not appended, the audience would be left hanging, expecting yet another variation to begin. Rondo form. Of all musical forms, the rondo is perhaps the easiest to hear, because a single, unvaried theme returns again and again. The rondo is also one of the oldest forms, having existed since the Middle Ages in the guise of the vocal rondo and since the Baroque era in the ritornello form of the concerto. A true classical rondo must have at least 3 statements of the refrain and at least 2 contrasting sections. Often the placement of the refrain creates symmetrical patterns such as abacà, abacaba, or even abacada. Haydn and Mozart infused the rondo with musical processes found in sonata, allegro form, specifically, transitional and developmental writing. They thereby created a more elastic, flexible rondo environment in which the refrain and, more often, the contrasting sections might develop and expand dramatically. As in the following piece by Mozart, the rondo is typically light, quick, and jovial in nature. Classical composers most often chose the rondo form for the finale of a sonata, quartet, or symphony. The carefree tune and the easily grasped digressions lend to the rondo finale an upbeat feeling, the musical equivalent of a happy ending. Figure 18.3. A portrait of Joseph Haydn at work. His left hand is trying an idea at the keyboard while his right is ready to write it down. Haydn said about his compositional process, "I sat down at the keyboard and began to improvise. Once I had seized upon an idea, my whole effort was to develop and sustain it." The Art Archive. Eileen Tweedy. Mozart, Horn Concerto in E major, K. 495, third movement. In his short lifetime, Mozart wrote more than 650 compositions, an enormous amount of music. To help us keep track of them, a musicologist in the 19th century, Ludwig von Kochel, published a list of Mozart's works in approximate chronological order, and even today we identify Mozart's compositions by a Kochel number. This is especially handy in the case of Mozart's 4 concertos for the French horn, 3 of which he composed in E. How else could we differentiate them without a number? Thus, the concerto in E written in Vienna in 1786 is identified as K. 495. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 11, Form, Rondo, Sonata, Allegro, and Theme and Variations, at the text website. The fact that Mozart wrote 3 of his 4 horn concertos in E major tells us something about the French horn in the classical era. It was a natural horn, and it was set to play in only a few tonal centers, usually in keys with flats. Because the French horn then had no valves or mechanical keys, it also had difficulty playing a fully chromatic scale in tune. For that reason, composers wrote for the horn what it could play easily, repeated notes, as well as triads spun out as arpeggios. Mozart conceived all 4 of his horn concertos with one performer in mind, Joseph Lütgeb. Mozart had grown up with Lütgeb in Salzburg and counted him among his best friends, one at whom he could poke fun. Thus, the inscription to the first horn concerto in E reads, "Wolfgang Amade Mozart has taken pity on Lütgeb, ass, ox, and fool." All 4 horn concertos by Mozart end with a movement in rondo form. The horn had something of a light-hearted, playful sound in Mozart's day, one well suited to the similarly light-hearted, playful quality of the classical rondo. Figure 18.4. A natural French horn of the late 18th century, the sort of horn that would have been used in the classical orchestras of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. Museum of Fine Arts, Boston Lebrecht. Listening Exercise 24. Mozart. Horn Concerto in E major. 214. 117. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. The key to hearing rondo form is to recognize the refrain and know when it has returned. Sometimes it is useful to make a simple melodic graph to help differentiate between the refrain and the contrasting material. 1. Which of the three melodic graphs most closely approximates the beginning of the refrain? 2. Judging from the refrain at the beginning of this movement, which of the following is true? A. The natural French horn can play repeated pitches and triads easily but not scales. B. The natural French horn can play scales easily but not repeated pitches or triads. 3. Listen again to the beginning. Which is true? A. The French horn is accompanied quietly by strings. B. The French horn plays entirely by itself at the beginning. 4. When the orchestra repeats the refrain, does the French horn play along? A. Yes. B. No. 5. The first part of contrasting theme B enters here. Which melodic graph in question 1 above does it most closely approximate? A. B. B. C. C. 6. The first part of contrasting theme C enters here. Which melodic graph in question 1 above does it most closely approximate? A. B. B. C. C. 7. How many times in all does the French horn play the refrain in this rondo form movement? A. 3 times. B. 4 times. C. 5 times. D. 6 times. 8. Although Mozart provides no tempo marking for this finale, he intended it to be performed at which tempo? A. Lento. B. Adagio. C. Allegro. 9. As is also true of most rondos, which of the following is correct? A. The refrain is always in a happy-sounding major key. B. The only shift to minor occurs in a contrasting theme. C. Both of the above. 10. Judging from this movement and your experience with sonata, allegro form, as well as with theme and variations form, which is true? A. In theme and variations form, there is usually only one theme, but it is continually ornamented and altered. B. In rondo form, only one theme predominates, and it usually appears unaltered. C. In sonata, allegro form, there are many themes, and often no one theme predominates. D. All of the above. E. None of the above. Rondo by Sting. Although the rondo may have enjoyed its greatest favor in the sphere of art music during the Baroque and Classical periods, it lived on in the realm of folk and popular song, undoubtedly because the refrain pattern has such universal appeal. Traditional ballads such as Tom Dooley make use of it, and so do more recent pop songs. Every Breath You Take, composed by Sting and recorded in 1983 by his new wave group The Police, produces a rondo pattern that in its symmetrical, indeed palindromic, shape would do any classical composer proud. Indeed, this song has now been around for more than 25 years and has become something of a classic itself, reborn as the title track of The Police's greatest hits compilation Every Breath You Take, The Classics. The song has also crossed over into the classical pop repertoire, having been recorded in 2000 by the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra of London. It crossed back in 2002, becoming hip-hop in the hands of Sean Puffy Combs. According to Wikipedia, the rondo, Every Breath You Take, still earns Sting $2,000 per day in royalties. What the rest of US wouldn't give for just one moment of equally lucrative inspiration. Sting. George DeSoto. Getty Images. Text not available due to copyright restrictions. Form, mood, and the listener's expectations. When today we attend a concert of classical music, of a symphony orchestra, for example, most of the music on the program will have been played by that orchestra and in that hall many times over the years. These favorite overtures, symphonies, and concertos belong to the canon of Western classical music. When concertgoers stepped into a hall in the late 18th century, however, they expected all of the music to be new and up to date. Why would anyone want to hear old music? But while the late 18th century audience didn't know the pieces in advance, listeners did come with certain expectations. Not only about the musical form but also about the mood of the music. For the classical period, we might summarize these as follows. Ludwig van Beethoven and later composers of the Romantic era modified somewhat this conventional format. The third movement, for example, was often treated as a boisterous scherzo rather than an elegant minuet. Yet the classical model of what was good and what should be expected endured. Succeeding generations not only wanted to hear new music but increasingly wanted to return to the tried and true works of Haydn, Mozart, and their later contemporary Beethoven. The beginnings of the canon of Western music, and the forms these pieces should follow, were the product of the classical era. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lectures at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: theme and variations, rondo finale, cockle number, canon. 19 classical genres, instrumental music. In music, the term genre simply means the type or class of music to which we listen. The string quartet is a genre of music just as is the country music ballad, the 12-bar blues piece, the military march, and the rap song. When we listen to a piece of music, we come armed with expectations as to how it will sound, how long it will last, and how we should behave. We may even go to a special place, an opera house or a bar, and dress a certain way, in gown and diamond earrings or black leather jacket and nose rings, for example. It all depends on the genre of music we expect to hear. If you change the genre, you change the audience, and vice versa. In the age of Mozart, there were 5 main genres of art music: the symphony, string quartet, sonata, concerto, and opera. Opera, of course, had been around since the early Baroque era. The sonata and concerto, too, had existed during the Baroque, but they underwent such change at the hands of Haydn and Mozart that each became essentially a new genre. The symphony and string quartet were entirely new to the classical period, created in no small part by Haydn. Download a supplementary listening guide for Haydn's Symphony No. 95, Movements 1-4, at the text website. The symphony and the symphony orchestra. During the classical era, the symphony became the preeminent genre of instrumental music. The fact that Haydn composed so many, and Mozart an even more astonishing number, shows that the symphony had become, and would remain, a staple of concert life. The symphony traces its origins to the late 17th century Italian opera overture called the Sinfonia. Around 1700, the typical Italian sinfonia was a one-movement instrumental work in 3 sections: fast, slow, fast. Soon, Italian musicians and foreigners alike took the sinfonia out of the opera house and expanded it into 3 separate and distinct movements. A 4th movement, the minuet, was inserted by composers north of the Alps beginning in the 1740s. Thus, by mid-century the symphony had emerged as a major instrumental genre and assumed its familiar 4-movement format: fast, slow, minuet, fast. The public favor that the symphony came to enjoy was tied to progressive social changes that swept Europe during the Enlightenment, including the appearance of public concerts. The center of musical life in such cities as London, Paris, and, to a lesser degree, Vienna gradually shifted from the aristocratic court to the newly constructed or refurbished public concert hall. Among these halls were the Hanover Square Rooms in London, where Haydn's London symphonies premiered, and the Burg Theatre in Vienna, where many of Mozart's symphonies and concertos were first heard. All but a few of Haydn's last 20 symphonies were composed for public performance in Paris and London, and Mozart wrote no symphonies for a court patron during the last 10 years of his life. His famous G minor symphony was apparently first performed in a casino in central Vienna. That's where the people were and that's where the money was to be found. Figure 19-1. The New Market in Vienna in the late 1700s. The building on the far right housed the casino, and it was here that Mozart's G minor symphony was apparently first performed in 1788. Even today, famous musicians, such as Placido Domingo and Sting, perform in casinos, because that's where the money is. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. The audiences at these public concerts in the capital cities of Europe increasingly came to hear the symphony and the large ensemble that played it. A symphony usually opened and closed each concert. Indeed, so closely did the genre of the symphony come to be linked with the performing force called the orchestra, that the instrumental group came to be called a symphony orchestra. The classical symphony orchestra. As the place of performance of the symphony orchestra moved from the private salon to the public auditorium, the size of both orchestra and audience increased. During the 1760s and 1770s, the orchestra at the court of Haydn's patron, Prince Nikolaus Esterházy, was never larger than 25, and the audience at court was often only the prince and his staff. But when Haydn went to London in 1791, his orchestra and audiences alike were much larger. By 1795, Haydn's orchestra had more than doubled in size, now consisting of some 60 players. He conducted his London symphonies in the public Hanover Square Rooms, which typically held 800, 900 people but sometimes more, for one concert in the spring of 1792, nearly 1,500 eager patrons crowded the hall. Figure 19.2. A watercolor of 1775 shows Haydn leading the small orchestra at the court of the Esterhazy princes during a performance of a comic opera. The composer is seated at the keyboard, surrounded by the cellos. The higher strings and woodwinds are seated in 2 rows at the desk. Deutsches Theatermuseum, Munich. Copyright the Bridgman Art Library. Mozart's experience in Vienna was similar. For the public concerts he mounted in the Bert Theater in the mid-1780s, he engaged an orchestra of 35-40 players. But in a letter of 1781, he mentions an orchestra of 80 instrumentalists including 40 violins, 10 violas, 8 cellos, and 10 double basses. While this was an exceptional ensemble brought together for a special benefit concert, it shows that at times a very large group could be assembled. It also reveals that a large number of string players could be assigned to play just one string part, as many as 20 might double each other on the first violin line, for example. To balance the growth in the string section, and to increase the variety of color in the orchestra, more winds were added. Now, instead of just one oboe or one bassoon, there were usually pairs. And a new woodwind, the clarinet, was welcomed into the orchestra. Mozart was especially fond of the clarinet and introduced it into his symphonies as early as 1778. Moreover, Mozart began to write independent lines for his woodwinds, not being satisfied with simply using them to double the string parts, as often happened in Baroque. Scores. Independent woodwind lines added not only color but also contrapuntal density to the orchestral fabric. By the 1790s, a typical symphony orchestra in a large European city might include the instrumentalists listed below. Compared to the Baroque orchestra, this ensemble of up to 40 players was larger, more colorful, and more flexible. Strings. First violins, second violins, violas, cellos, double basses, woodwinds, 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, brasses, 2 French horns, 2 trumpets, percussion, 2 timpani. Mozart, Symphony No. 40 in G minor, K. 550. Mozart's celebrated symphony in G minor requires all the full instrumental sound and disciplined playing the late 18th century orchestra could muster. This is not a festive composition, but rather an intensely brooding work that suggests tragedy and despair. While we might be tempted to associate the minor key and despondent mood with a specific event in Mozart's life, apparently no such causal relationship exists. This was one of 3 symphonies, his last 3, that Mozart produced in the incredibly short span of 6 weeks during the summer of 1788, and the other 2 are sunny, optimistic works. Rather than responding to a particular disappointment, it is more likely that Mozart invoked the tragic muse in this G minor symphony by drawing on a lifetime of disappointments and a premonition, as his letters attest, of an early death, to come 3 years later. First movement. Exposition. Although Mozart begins his G minor symphony with a textbook example of classical phrase structure, an unusual sense of urgency is created by the repeating, insistent 8th note figure at the beginning. This urgent motive is immediately grasped by the listener and becomes the most memorable theme in the work. Embedded in the motive is a falling half step, a tight interval used throughout the history of music to denote pain and suffering. Example 19:1. Not so quickly seized, but still contributing equally to the sense of urgency, is the accelerating rate of harmonic change. At the outset, chords are set beneath the melody at an interval of 1 chord every 4 measures, then 1 every 2 bars, then 1 every measure, then 2 chords per measure, and finally 4. Thus, the harmonic rhythm is moving 16 times faster at the end of this section than at the start. This is how Mozart creates the sense of drive and urgency we all feel yet may be unable to explain. After this quickening start, the first theme begins once again but soon veers off its previous course, initiating the transition. Transitions take us somewhere, usually by means of running scales, and this one is no exception. What is unusual is that a new motive is inserted, one so distinctive that we might call it a transition theme. As if to reciprocate for an extra theme here, Mozart dispenses with one toward the end of the exposition, at the point where we would expect a closing theme to appear. Instead, as closing material, he uses the persistent motive and rhythm from the beginning of the first theme, which rather nicely rounds off the exposition. Finally, a single, isolated chord is heard, one that first leads back to a repeat of the exposition and then, after the second statement of the exposition, launches into the development. Development. In the development, Mozart employs only the first theme, but subjects it to a variety of musical treatments. He first pushes it through several distantly related keys, next shapes it into a fugue subject for use in a fugato, then sets it as a descending melodic sequence, and finally inverts the direction of the half-step motive. Example 19, 2. The retransition is suddenly interrupted by sforzandi. But soon a dominant pedal point sounds in the bassoons, and above it, the flute and clarinets cascade like a musical waterfall down to the tonic pitch. This use of colorful, solo woodwinds in the retransition is a hallmark of Mozart's symphonic style. Recapitulation. As expected, the recapitulation offers the themes in the same order in which they appeared in the exposition. But now the transition theme, which Mozart has left untouched since its initial appearance, receives extended treatment, creating something akin to a second development section as it charges through one new key after another, only to end up right back in the original tonic minor. When the lyrical second theme finally reappears, now in the minor mode, its mood is somber and plaintive. Because the repeating figure of the first theme rounds off the recapitulation by way of a closing theme, only the briefest coda is needed to end this passionate, haunting movement. Listening exercise 25. Mozart. Symphony No. 40 in G minor. 2:15-17. 1:18-20. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. As mentioned, Mozart was the first composer to integrate colorful writing for independent woodwinds, including the clarinet, into his symphonic scores. Yet the strings remained the core of the classical symphony orchestra. The following exercise asks you to consider the relationship between woodwinds and strings in one of Mozart's most famous symphonic movements. Midnight to 1:52 exposition. 1. Which instruments begin by playing the haunting melody? A. Violins. B. Clarinets. C. Cellos. 2. When do the woodwinds first enter? A. 008. B. 016. C. 022. 3. What do the French horns do in this transition, something that is typical of the horns in orchestras during the classical period? A. They stand out by playing independent solo melodies as in a horn concerto. B. They add background resonance by quietly repeating one or two pitches. 4. Which is true about the orchestration of the second theme? A. The strings begin with the theme, and then the woodwinds take it over. B. The woodwinds begin with the theme, and then the strings take it over. 5. Echoes of the first theme close the exposition. Which woodwind instrument plays a main motive of the first theme? A. French horn. B. Clarinet. C. Bassoon. D. Oboe. 149-333 repeat of exposition. 6. Which family of instruments dominates the first section of the development? A. Woodwinds. B. Strings. C. Brasses. 7. Which family of instruments dominates the end of the development, the retransition? A. Woodwinds. B. Strings. C. Brasses. 8. At the beginning of the recapitulation, Mozart reorchestrates his score. Which of the following is true? A. The melody is now assigned to the woodwinds. B. A flute plays a new contrapuntal line against the melody. C. A bassoon plays a new contrapuntal line against the melody. 9. Which is true about Mozart's reorchestration of the second theme? A. The woodwinds begin with the theme, and then the strings take it over. B. The strings begin with the theme, and then the woodwinds take it over. 10. In sum, which of the following is true about this movement? A. The woodwinds introduce all themes, the violins add color and counterpoint, and the brasses play sustaining pitches in the background. B. The violins introduce all themes, the woodwinds add color and counterpoint, and the brasses play sustaining pitches in the background. C. The brasses introduce all themes, the woodwinds add color and counterpoint, and the violins play sustaining pitches in the background. Second movement. After the feverish excitement of the opening movement, the slow, lyrical andante comes as a welcome change of pace. What makes this movement exceptionally beautiful is the extraordinary interplay between the light and dark colors of the woodwinds against the constant tone of the strings. If there is no thematic contrast and confrontation here, there is, nonetheless, heartfelt expression brought about by Mozart's masterful use of orchestral color. Third movement. We expect the aristocratic minuet to provide elegant, graceful dance music. But much to our surprise, Mozart returns to the intense, somber mood of the opening movement. This he does, in part, by choosing to write in the tonic minor key, a rare minuet in minor. This again demonstrates how the minuet had changed from dance music to listening music. Fourth movement. The finale starts with an ascending rocket that explodes in a rapid, forte flourish, and only carefully rehearsed string playing can bring off the brilliant effect of this opening gesture. The contrasting second theme of this sonata, allegro form movement, is typically Mozartian in its grace and charm, a proper foil to the explosive opening melody. Midway through the development, musical compression takes hold. There is no retransition, only a pregnant pause before the recapitulation. The return dispenses with the repeats built into the first theme, and a coda is omitted. This musical foreshortening at the end produces the same psychological effect experienced at the very beginning of the symphony, a feeling of urgency and acceleration. The string quartet. The symphony is the ideal genre for the public concert hall, for it aims to please a large listening public. The string quartet, on the other hand, typifies chamber music, music for the small concert hall, for the private chamber, or, often, just for the enjoyment of the performers themselves. Unlike the symphony, which might have a dozen violinists joining on the first violin line, the string quartet has only one player per part: first violinist, second violinist, violist, and cellist. Moreover, there is no conductor. All performers function equally and communicate directly among themselves. No wonder the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe compared the string quartet to a conversation among four intelligent people. All chamber music, whether for string quartet, solo piano or violin, wind quintet, or even string octet, employs just one player on a part. Of these chamber media, the string quartet is historically the most important. Joseph Haydn is rightly called the father of the string quartet. In the 1760s and 1770s, he took the trio sonata, the staple of Baroque chamber music, and made it into something new. He removed the old basso continuo and replaced it with a more melodically active bass played by an agile cello alone. And he enriched the middle of the texture by adding a viola, playing immediately above the cello. If the Baroque trio sonata had a top and bottom heavy texture, the newer classical string quartet shows a texture covered evenly by four instruments, each of which participates more or less equally in a give and take of theme and motive. Figure 19.3. A representation of a string quartet at the end of the 18th century. The string quartet was at first an ensemble for playing chamber music in the home. Not until 1804 did a string quartet appear in a public concert in Vienna, and not until 1814 in Paris. Copyright the Art Archive Johnny Dagli Ordi. The string quartet, of course, is not only a performing force but also a musical genre. The classical string quartet has four movements that are identical to those of the classical symphony: fast, slow, minuet, fast. Moreover, in a set of quartets he wrote in 1772, Haydn dubbed each minuet a scherzo, aptly characterizing the high-spirited style of playing intended for this third movement. It was the chance to play string quartets together that gave rise to a lasting friendship between Haydn and Mozart. During 1784-1785, the two men met in Vienna, sometimes at the home of an aristocrat, and other times in Mozart's own apartment. In their quartet, Haydn played first violin, and Mozart viola. As a result of this experience, Mozart was inspired to dedicate a set of his best works in this genre to the older master, which he published in 1785. Yet in this convivial, domestic music-making, Haydn and Mozart merely joined in the fashion of the day. For whether in Vienna, Paris, or London, aristocrats and members of the well-to-do middle class were encouraged to play quartets with friends, as well as to engage professional musicians to entertain their guests. Haydn, Opus 76, No. 3, The Emperor Quartet. Haydn's Emperor Quartet, written in Vienna during the summer of 1797, numbers among the best works of the string quartet genre. It is known as the Emperor because it makes liberal use of the Emperor's Hymn, a melody that Haydn composed in response to the military and political events of his day. In 1796, the armies of Napoleon invaded the Austrian Empire, which ignited a firestorm of patriotism in Vienna, the Austrian capital. But the Austrians were at a musical disadvantage. The French now had the Marseillaise, and the English had their God Save the King, but the Austrians had no national anthem. To this end, the ministers of state approached Haydn, who quickly fashioned one to the text, Gott erhalt Franz den Kaiser, in honor of the reigning Austrian Emperor Franz II. Called the Emperor's Hymn, it was first sung in theaters throughout the Austrian realm on the Emperor's birthday, February 12, 1797. Later that year, Haydn took the tune and worked it into a string quartet. In truth, when Haydn fashioned Quartet Opus 76, No. 3, he made use of his imperial hymn mainly in the slow, second movement, where it serves as the basis of a theme and variations set. The theme is first presented by the first violin and harmonized in simple chords. For variations follow in which the theme is ornamented but never altered. All four instruments are given equal opportunity to hold forth with the tune. Even the cello, more flexible and lyrical than the double bass of the orchestra, can participate as an equal partner. Example 19-3 shows how in the classical string quartet the melodic profile of each of the lines is more or less the same, a far cry from the melody-walking bass polarity that typified the earlier Baroque trio sonata. Figures 19.4 and 19.5. Title page of 6 string quartets by Mozart dedicated to Haydn. Mozart offers them to Haydn as 6 children, asking Haydn to be their father, guide, and friend. Franz II, last Holy Roman Emperor, first Emperor of Austria. Haydn composed the Emperor's Hymn in his honor. Photo: the Ida Kuhn Loeb Music Library of the Harvard College Library. Copyright Bildarchiv Preußischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. Example 19.3. Listening Exercise 26. Haydn, Emperor Quartet. 2:18-19. 1:21-22. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. In a symphony, 2 or more players can join together on just one line. Similarly, with a large ensemble, various sorts of crowd-pleasing special effects are possible. A string quartet, on the other hand, produces a purer, more abstract, more exposed sound, one that requires very careful playing and equally careful listening. The following exercise encourages you to think about the difference between the genres of symphony and quartet. 1. How many performers play on each of the 4 parts of a string quartet? A. 1B, 2C, 3D, 4. Midnight to 1:26 theme. 2. Listen to the theme. Why does it sound so secure and firm, an appropriate musical vehicle to represent a national identity? A. Because all the notes are the same length. B. Because the theme starts low and ends high. C. Because each phrase is the same length and each ends on a dominant or tonic note. 128, 246 Variation 1. 3. The second violin has the theme while the first violin rapidly ornaments above. Do the viola and cello play at all during this variation? A. Yes. B. No. 248, 411 Variation 2. 4. The cello has the theme in this variation. Would you say the instrument is playing in the higher or the lower part of its range? A. Higher. B. Lower. Midnight to 1:23 Variation 3. 5. The viola has the melody but is gradually joined by the other instruments. Which instrument is the last to enter in this variation? A. First violin. B. Second violin. C. Cello. 6. The musical texture in this variation is what? A. Homophonic. B. Polyphonic. 125-251 Variation 4. 7. This last variation sounds otherworldly or ethereal. How is it that the quartet makes it sound this way? A. They play with no vibrato. B. They play with a great deal of vibrato. C. They have slowed the tempo down to a crawl. 252, and a brief coda. 8. In what way does Haydn conclude the movement? A. He has the players execute a fade-out by means of a retard and diminuendo. B. He produces a special effect by having the players drive toward a grand fortissimo climax. 9. Which ensemble might we say is a more democratic institution? A. A symphony orchestra. B. A string quartet. 10. If you were a violinist prone to playing wrong notes, in which ensemble would you be more comfortable performing? A. A symphony orchestra. B. A string quartet. The popularity of the Emperor's Hymn did not end with the defeat of Napoleon in 1815 or the death of Emperor Franz II in 1835. So alluring is Haydn's melody that with altered text it became a Protestant hymn, as well as the national anthem of Austria and Germany. It was also Haydn's own favorite piece, and he played a piano arrangement of it daily. In fact, the Emperor's Hymn was the last music Haydn played before he died in the early hours of May 31, 1809. The Sonata. Most children who study a Western musical instrument will play a sonata at one time or another. Like the symphony and the string quartet, the sonata was a genre of classical music that took its definitive shape during the classical era. And, as with these other genres, each movement of a sonata usually makes use of one or another of the forms favored by classical composers: sonata, allegro, ternary, rondo, or theme and variations. The sonata came to enjoy great popularity during the classical period. According to publishers' inventories from the end of the 18th century, more sonatas were printed than any other type of music. The explanation for this sudden vogue is tied to the equally sudden popularity of the piano. Indeed, the word sonata has become so closely associated with the piano that unless otherwise qualified as violin sonata, cello sonata, or the like, we usually assume that sonata refers to a three-movement work for piano. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 18, Piano Music of Mozart and Beethoven, at the text website. Who played this flood of new sonatas for the piano? Amateur musicians, mostly women, who practiced and performed for polite society in the comfort of their own homes. As we have seen, in Mozart's time, the ability to play the piano, to do fancy needlework, and to utter a few selected words of French were thought by male-dominated society all that was necessary to be a cultured young lady. To teach the musical handicraft, instructors were needed. Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven all served as piano teachers in fashionable circles early in their careers. The piano sonatas they composed for their many pupils were not intended to be played in the public concert halls. Rather, sonatas were to provide students with material that they might practice to develop technique and that they might play as musical entertainment in the home. Even among the 32 splendid piano sonatas that Beethoven composed, only one was ever performed at a public concert in Vienna during his lifetime. Download a supplementary listening guide for Mozart, Sonata in B Major, at the text website. The concerto. With the genre of the concerto, we leave the salon or private chamber and return to the public concert hall. The classical concerto, like the symphony, was a large-scale, three-movement work for instrumental soloist and orchestra intended for a public audience. While the symphony might have provided the greatest musical substance at a concert, audiences were often lured to the hall by the prospect of hearing a virtuoso performer play a concerto. Then as now, audiences were fascinated with personal virtuosity and all the daring-do that a stunning technical display might bring. Gone was the Baroque tradition of the concerto grosso, in which a group of soloists stepped forward from the full orchestra and then receded back into it. From this point forward, the concerto was a solo concerto, usually for piano but sometimes for violin, cello, French horn, trumpet, or woodwind. In the new concerto, the soloist commanded all the audience's attention. Credit for the creation of the classical piano concerto must go to Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart alone. Just as Haydn can be said to have created the string quartet, so Mozart can be dubbed the father of the modern piano concerto. Indeed, Mozart wrote more piano concertos than any other important composer in history, 23 in all. And his motivation was money. After cutting himself loose from the patronage of the Archbishop of Salzburg in 1781 and establishing residence in Vienna, Mozart no longer had an annual salary on which to rely. The Viennese were eager to hear brilliant passage work and dazzling displays of keyboard virtuosity. The piano concerto was for Mozart the perfect vehicle for such a display. At each of the public concerts he produced, Mozart offered one or two of his latest concertos. But he had to do more. He was responsible for renting the hall, hiring the orchestra, leading rehearsals, attracting an audience, and selling tickets from his apartment, all this in addition to composing the music and appearing as solo virtuoso. But when all went well, Mozart could make a killing, as a music journal of March 22, 1783, reported. Today the celebrated Chevalier Mozart gave a musical concert for his own benefit at the Burt Theatre in which pieces of his own music, which was already very popular, were performed. The concert was honored by the presence of an extraordinarily large audience, and the two new concertos and other fantasies which Mr. Mozart played on the forte piano were received with the loudest approval. Our monarch, who contrary to his custom honored the entire concert with his presence, joined in the applause of the public so heartily that one can think of no similar example. The proceeds of the concert are estimated at 1,600 gulden. 1,600 gulden was the equivalent of about $140,000 today, and more than 5 times the annual salary of Mozart's father. With a take such as this, young Mozart could, at least for a time, indulge his expensive tastes. Figure 19.6. One of the few surviving tickets to a concert given by Mozart in Vienna. These were sold in advance, not from a ticket agency, but from Mozart's own apartment. Internationale Stiftung Mozarteum, Salzburg, Austria. Mozart, Piano Concerto in A major, K. 488. We derive our term concerto from the Italian word concertare. It means above all else, to strive together, but it also resonates with a sense of to struggle against. In a piano concerto, the piano and orchestra engage in a spirited give-and-take of thematic material. The piano, perhaps more than any instrument, can compete on an equal footing with the orchestra. Mozart composed his piano concerto in A major of 1786 for one of his star pupils, Barbara Ployer. First movement. As with all of Mozart's concertos, this one is in 3 movements. And, as is invariably the case, the first movement is written in sonata, allegro form. Here, however, it is modified to meet the special demands and opportunities of the concerto. What results is double exposition form, an extension of sonata, allegro form in which the orchestra plays one exposition and the soloist then plays another. First, the orchestra presents the first, second, and closing themes, all in the tonic key. Then the soloist enters and, with orchestral assistance, offers the piano's version of the same material, but modulating to the dominant before the second theme. After the piano expands the closing theme, part of the first theme group returns, a throwback to the ritornello principle of the old Baroque concerto grosso. Then a surprise, just when we expect this second exposition to end, Mozart inserts a lyrical new melody played by the strings. This is another feature of the classical concerto, a melody held back for last-minute presentation, a way of keeping the listener on guard during the second exposition. Figure 19.7. Mozart's piano, preserved in the house of his birth in Salzburg, Austria. The keyboard spans only 5 octaves, and the black and white color scheme of the keys is reversed, both typical features of the late 18th century piano. Mozart purchased the instrument in 1784, 2 years before he composed his A major piano concerto. Bildarchiv Preußischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. The development here is concerned exclusively with exploiting the new theme that appeared at the end of the second exposition. The recapitulation compresses the 2 expositions into one, presenting the themes in the same order as before but now all in the tonic key. Finally, toward the end of the movement, the orchestra suddenly stops its forward motion and comes to rest on a single chord for several moments. Using this chord as a point of departure, the pianist plunges headlong into a flight of virtuosic fancy called a cadenza. In a cadenza, the soloist, playing alone, mixes rapid runs, arpeggios, and snippets of previously heard themes into a fantasy-like improvisation. Indeed, Mozart didn't write down this cadenza when he himself performed it, but improvised it on the spot, just as in our own century a talented jazz musician might improvise an extended solo. After a minute or so of this virtuosic dazzle, the pianist plays a trill, a signal to the orchestra that it is time for it to re-enter the competition. From here to the end, the orchestra holds forth, making use of the original closing theme. There is much to absorb in the long listening guide that follows, but the glorious music of Mozart will amply reward the attentive listener. Figure 19.8. A young woman performs a keyboard concerto in 1777. When Mozart moved to Vienna in 1781 he was forced to earn a living, so he gave composition lessons and piano lessons. Among his best female students was Barbara Ployer, for whom he wrote the piano concerto in a minor discussed here. Courtesy Graphisch Sammlung, Zentralbibliothek Zurich. Second movement. The essence of this movement rests in Mozart's exquisitely crafted lines and coloristic harmonies. This is the only work the Viennese master ever wrote in the remote key of F-sharp minor, and the daring harmonic changes it contains prefigure those of the Romantic era. Musicians who have lived with Mozart's music from childhood to old age continue to be profoundly moved by this extraordinary movement. It is at once sublimely beautiful and distantly remote, its ending as cold and desolate as death itself. Download a supplementary listening guide for another Mozart piano concerto, Concerto No. 17 in G major, at the text website. Third movement. The sublime pessimism of the Andante is suddenly shattered by a boisterous rondo refrain in the piano. As Mozart was well aware, this movement, not the previous slow one, had the kind of music the fun-loving Viennese would pay to hear. And in this rondo, his subscribers got more than they bargained for. The soloist and orchestra do not simply speak in turn, but rather banter back and forth in the most playful and pleasing way. "Anything you can do, I can do better. No, you can't. Yes, I can," the antagonists seem to say. In Mozart's contest between interactive forces, there is no winner, except the listener. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercises interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words. Genre: Sinfonia, Symphony, String Quartet, Scherzo, Solo, Concerto, Double, Exposition, Form, Cadenza. 20 Classical genres. Vocal music. While it would be wrong to overlook the many wonderful masses for the Roman Catholic liturgy written by Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, nonetheless opera rightly commands our attention when we consider the vocal music of the classical period. Then as now, the public embraced opera because, in addition to beautiful music, it had glamour, star appeal, and all the excitement of the theater. Classical opera. Opera is drama, yes, but drama propelled by music. In the classical period, opera maintained the essential features it had developed during the Baroque era. It still began with an overture, was divided into 2 or 3 acts, and made use of a succession of arias and recitatives, along with an occasional choral number. And, of course, it still was performed in a theater large enough to accommodate both an orchestra and elaborate stage sets. Opera in the 18th century was marked by the rise of comic opera, a powerful voice for social change during the Enlightenment. The statue-like gods, goddesses, emperors, and queens of the old Baroque opera seria gradually departed the stage, making room for more natural, realistic characters drawn from everyday life, a barber and a maid, for example. Where Baroque opera posed magnificently, classical opera moves fluidly. Arias and recitatives flow easily from one to another, and the mood of the music changes rapidly to reflect the quick-moving, often comic, events on stage. Comic opera introduces a new element into the opera house, the vocal ensemble, which allows the plot to unfold more quickly. Instead of waiting for each character to sing successively, 3 or more characters can express their own particular emotions simultaneously. One might sing of her love, another of his fear, another of her outrage, while a fourth pokes fun at the other 3. If an author does that in a play, what results is a jumble. If a composer does that in an opera, what results is a vocal ensemble. Composers often placed vocal ensembles at the ends of acts to help spark a rousing conclusion, one in which all the principals might appear on stage. The vocal ensemble typifies the more democratic spirit, and better dramatic pacing, of the late 18th century. Mozart and opera. The master of classical opera, and of the vocal ensemble in particular, was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. While Haydn wrote more than a dozen operas and conducted others, he lacked Mozart's instinct for what was effective in the theater and what was not. Beethoven wrote only 1 opera, Fidelio, and he labored mightily on it, working through several revisions over the course of nearly 10 years. Neither Haydn nor Beethoven had Mozart's talent for lightning-quick changes in mood or his capacity for equally quick exchanges in musical dialogue, the sort of banter in music that we heard in his piano concerto. Mozart's music is inherently dramatic and perfectly suited to the stage. Mozart wrote Italian opera seria of the old Baroque sort as well as German comic opera, which was called Singspiel. Like a Broadway musical, a Singspiel is made up of spoken dialogue and songs. Mozart's best work of this type is Die Zauberflöte. But Mozart also wrote Italian comic operas. These include his masterpieces Le Nozze di Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte, all 3 with text by Lorenzo da Ponte. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale course class session 17, Mozart and his operas, at the text website. Mozart, Don Giovanni, K. 527. Don Giovanni has been called not only Mozart's greatest opera but also the greatest opera ever written. It tells the tale of an amoral philanderer, a Don Juan, who seduces and murders his way across Europe before being pursued and finally dragged down to hell by the ghost of a man whom he has killed. Because the seducer and mocker of public law and morality is a nobleman, Don Giovanni is implicitly critical of the aristocracy, and Mozart and da Ponte danced quickly to stay one step ahead of the imperial censor before production. Mozart's opera was first performed on October 29, 1787, in Prague, Czech Republic, a city in which his music was especially popular. As fate would have it, the most notorious Don Juan of the 18th century, Giacomo Casanova, was in the audience that first night in Prague. It turns out that he had a small hand in helping his friend da Ponte shape the libretto. The overture to Don Giovanni, as we have seen, is a fine example of sonata, allegro form. It begins with a slow introduction that incorporates several themes or motives important later in the opera. Just as an author may postpone writing a preface until after the book is finished, so a composer typically saves the overture for the end of the creative process. In this way, the overture can not only prefigure important themes in the opera but also characterize the overall tone of the work. Mozart, as was his tendency, postponed much of the writing of Don Giovanni until the last minute, and the overture was not completed until the night before the premiere, the copyist's ink still wet on the pages as the music was handed to the orchestra. Don Giovanni is a rare mix of serious and comic, and we begin with the latter. As the last strains of the overture die away, the curtain rises on the comic figure Leporello, Don Giovanni's faithful, though reluctant, servant. Leporello has been keeping a nocturnal vigil outside the house of Donna Anna while his master is inside attempting to satisfy his sexual appetite. Grumbling as he paces back and forth, Leporello sings about how he would gladly trade places with the fortunate aristocrat. Immediately, Mozart works to establish Leporello's musical character. He sets this opening aria in F major, a traditional key for the pastoral in music, showing that Leporello is a rustic fellow. He gives him a narrow vocal range without fancy chromaticism, and he has him sing quick, repeated notes, almost as if he were stuttering. This last technique, called patter song, is a stock device used to depict low-cast, inarticulate characters in comic opera. Figure 21. The man who wrote the librettos for Mozart's most important operas of the 1780s, including Don Giovanni, was Lorenzo da Ponte. Da Ponte was an Italian priest who, after the death of Mozart and a stay in London, emigrated to America in 1805. Once there, he ran a dry goods store in Sunbury, Pennsylvania, and worked as a trader, distiller, and occasional gunrunner during the War of 1812. Eventually, he moved to New York City, becoming the first professor of Italian literature at Columbia University in 1825. In 1826 he sponsored a performance of Don Giovanni, the first opera by Mozart to be performed in America. Ibrecht Colorizer A.L. As Leporello concludes his complaint, the masked Don Giovanni rushes on stage, chased by the virtuous Donna Anna. Here the strings rush up the scale and the music modulates up a fourth to signify that we are now dealing with the highborn. The victim of Don Giovanni's unwanted sexual advances, Donna Anna wants her assailant captured and unmasked. While the gentleman and lady carry on a musical tug-of-war in long notes above, the cowering Leporello patters away fearfully below. This excellent example of vocal ensemble makes clear the conflicting emotions of each party. Now Donna Anna's father, the commandant, enters to confront Don Giovanni. The listener senses that this bodes ill. There is a troubling tremolo in the strings, and the music shifts from major to minor mode. Our fear is immediately confirmed as the Don, first refusing to duel, draws his sword and attacks the aging commandant. In the brief exchange of steel, Mozart depicts the rising tension by means of ascending chromatic scales and tight, tense chords. At the very moment Don Giovanni's sword pierces the commandant, the action stops and the orchestra sustains on a painful diminished chord, a chord comprised entirely of minor thirds. Mozart then clears the air of discord with a simple texture and accompaniment as Don Giovanni and Leporello gaze in horror on the dying commandant. In this vocal ensemble, three very different sentiments are conveyed simultaneously: surprise and satisfaction, the desire to flee, and the pain of a violent death. At the end, the listener can feel the commandant expire, his life sinking away through the slow descent of a chromatic scale. In its intensity and compression, only the opening scene of Shakespeare's King Lear rivals the beginning of Don Giovanni. Figure 22. Don Giovanni tries to seduce Donna Anna at the beginning of a 2005 British production of Mozart's Don Giovanni. Note the similarity in approach to the Phantom of the Opera by Andrew Lloyd Webber. Lloyd Webber drew heavily from Mozart's Don Giovanni. For example, the opera that the Phantom composes in Act II is called Don Juan Triumphant, which tries to tell this timeless tale of seduction from Don Juan's point of view. Tristram Kenton Lebrecht Music and Arts. When we next meet the unrepentant Don Giovanni, he is in pursuit of the country girl Zerlina. She is the betrothed of another peasant, Maceto, and the two are to be married the next day. Don Giovanni quickly dismisses Maceto and turns his charm on the naive Zerlina. First, he tries verbal persuasion carried off in simple recitative. Zerlina, he says, is too lovely for a country bumpkin like Maceto. Her beauty demands a higher state, she will become his wife. Download a supplementary listening guide for Mozart, Madamina, a patter song aria in which Leporello later shares Don Giovanni's Book of Conquests with Donna Anna, at the text website. Simple recitative now gives way to more passionate expression in the charming duet, La Si Darum la Mano. During this duet, Don Giovanni persuades Zerlina to extend her hand. He begins with a seductive melody cast squarely in the classical mold of two four-bar antecedent, consequent phrases. Zerlina repeats and extends this, but she still sings alone and untouched. The Don becomes more insistent in a new phrase. And Zerlina, in turn, becomes flustered, as her quick 16th notes reveal. The initial melody returns but is now sung together by the two principals, their voices intertwining. Musical union accompanies the act of physical touching that occurs on stage. Finally, as if to further affirm this coupling through music, Mozart adds a concluding section, in which the two characters skip off, arm in arm, their voices linked together, mainly in parallel moving thirds to show unity of feeling and purpose. These are the means by which a skilled composer like Mozart can underscore, through music, the drama unfolding on the stage. Download a supplementary listening guide for Mozart, Ho Capito, Maceto's aria in response to Don Giovanni's advances on his fiancée, at the text website. In the end, the frightful ghost of the dead commandant confronts Don Giovanni and orders him to repent. Ever defiant, Don Giovanni cries, "No, no," and is dragged down to hell to the sounds of Mozart's most demonic music. It is the admixture of divine beauty and sinister power that makes Don Giovanni a masterpiece of the highest order. No wonder Andrew Lloyd Webber paid homage to it in his long-running Phantom of the Opera. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale courses and view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: vocal ensemble singspiel diminished chord. Beethoven Bridge to Romanticism 21. No composer looms larger as an iconic figure than Ludwig van Beethoven. When we imagine the musician as artist, most likely it is the angry, defiant, disheveled Beethoven who comes to mind. Is it not the bust of Beethoven? Rather than the elegant Mozart or the stalwart Bach that sits atop Schroeder's piano in the comic strip Peanuts, is it not Beethoven who is the namesake of nearly a dozen popular kids' films? And, is it not Beethoven's Fifth Symphony that, in one episode of The Simpsons, inaugurates Springfield's new concert hall? Such observations are not mere trivialities. Beethoven is deeply ingrained in our popular culture. Even in his own day, Beethoven had a cult-like following, embraced as both mad genius and popular hero. Oblivious to the world, he walked about Vienna humming and scribbling music in a notebook. When he died in March 1827, 20,000 people turned out for the funeral. Schools closed, and the army mobilized to control the huge crowd, a final scene worthy of Michael Jackson. Figure 21-1. A somewhat glamorized portrait of 1819 showing Ludwig van Beethoven at work on his Missa Solemnis. In reality, Beethoven had a pockmarked face and was usually unshaven. Beethoven House, Bonn. The Bridgman Art Library. Beethoven's music. Today Beethoven's music continues to enjoy great popular favor. Statistics show that his symphonies, sonatas, and quartets are performed in concert and on radio more than those of any other classical composer. These works are tender but powerful, sometimes carefully controlled, sometimes exploding with musical violence. And just as Beethoven the composer struggled to overcome personal adversity, his growing deafness, so his music imparts a feeling of struggle and ultimate victory. It has a sense of rightness, even morality, about it. It elevates and inspires all of us. Historians have traditionally divided Beethoven's music into three periods: early, middle, and late. In many regards, his work belongs to the tradition of the classical Viennese style. Beethoven employs classical genres and classical forms. Yet even in compositions from his early period, Beethoven projects a new spirit in his music, one that foreshadows the musical style of the Romantic era. An intense, lyrical expression is heard in his slow movements, while his allegros abound with pounding rhythms, strong dynamic contrasts, and startling orchestral effects. Although Beethoven largely stays within the bounds of classical forms, he pushes their confines to the breaking point.